So I certainly will encourage people to have their screens on or their cameras on, but you don't be offended if some people don't. But yeah, welcome everyone. And Neela today is going to be talking about kind of the first of two sessions she'll give us. The second session will get more into anti-racism, but to lay the groundwork for that, she's going to be talking about demystifying EDI, which she'll go through, and unpacking the inclusion-exclusion cycle. And for those of you that are just tuning in, as much as you can, we'd like to have people show their video screens so Neela can have as interactive an audience as possible. And welcome, Neela.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Tyler. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Welcome everyone to the space, and I wish that it was in person. I know that I'm talking to people who spend a lot of time in labs, and I hope that with this space that we open up virtually, we can communicate, we can interact, we can have conversations. Welcome to a space that I would call safe, where we come in with our vulnerabilities. There is nothing here that I'm not the expert. I'm just in a journey of learning and unlearning like everybody else. Your expertise in the labs, of course I can't compete with that. And I have a certain expertise in what I'm talking about today, and I hope that it will resonate with your interests. Today is about demystifying EDI, and I don't like really using the acronym, but I would say demystifying equity, diversity, and inclusion, and unpacking the inclusion-exclusion cycle. For the sake of certain interactions, despite the isolation being at our homes or labs or our private spaces, please log in to slido.com. The number is, the code for the session is 586639. We will use this, Slido event. You will find the event, and when I ask you later on, you will be able to participate in these in these questions. So Slido 586639.
I'll add that to the chat function, Neela, in case people join in late.
Absolutely, yes.
Mike, you can't see the chat.
I would like to acknowledge that we are gathered today, even though virtually, on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam, ancestral and unceded territory of the Musqueam people, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. This land, with its history, resilience, and stories, and even its present, has been inspiring. When we acknowledge the land, I am inviting to acknowledge that we all acknowledge the struggles of indigenous people and how we are all, us, settlers and immigrants, responsible for supporting this land and its caretakers. I hope that the land acknowledgement is a first sign that we are here on this land, not as bystanders, but as upstanders, engaged with changing things for the benefit of all. And the first of them are the indigenous people and the indigenous land. I am one person in a great team that I'm proud to be belonging to. I'm part of the READY team, Respectful Environments, Diversity and Inclusion team, and I am the Anti-Racism, Anti-Oppression Advisor, a huge responsibility on my shoulders. What are the learning objectives? As Tyler identified at the beginning of this session is going to be composed of two parts. This part and one, which we have, decided that's going to happen in January. For these objectives, that we're going to be identifying manifestations of racism in medicine and healthcare. We need to acknowledge the major concepts related to equity, diversity, and inclusion. We will recognize the inclusion-exclusion cycle. I am particularly focusing this session on bias and microaggressions in healthcare, and particularly in everyday life. Discuss how power and privilege and how they operate. I hope that by the end of the session, we will leave with a sense that we have to engage with a strong commitment for change on the personal level and the institutional level. I start this presentation with grounding us in the goal of the Faculty of Medicine. And the Faculty of Medicine had a mission to transform health for everyone and identified 5 values in response. This will be the basis of a multi-year transforming culture initiative. I highlighted 3 important words here: respectful, inclusive, and diverse. Our mission as people engaged in this faculty, assuming that responsibility, bringing the brand, enjoying the privileges of being part of that prestigious faculty, we have all commitment to move forward with these principles and values. This number 1, we're going to be reflecting and acknowledging. My first poll, you will find it already activated. Why do equity, diversity, and inclusion matter to you? If it ever matters to you. And this is about very simple, jot any word for you. Is it a personal commitment? Is it for work requirement? Is it because it makes life even better? Why does it matter to you? The importance of this question realizes that there is no change that can happen if we don't think and connect it to our personal experiences. We cannot engage with any issues in terms of change unless we examine how we are connected to that on a personal level. So why do equity, diversity, and inclusion matter? Thank you so much. I think you see that someone put, because all people must be treated with respect in ways that acknowledge their intersectionalities, their various roles in a context. Thank you so much. Moral reasons, absolutely. To ensure equal opportunity for all. I think you put the point here, which is we have a moral obligation, first of all. Second, we have to treat people in a manner that respects their uniqueness in terms of intersectional and intersectionality. I think that when we are talking about this, please keep the question with you while doing all this work, all these changes, all these transforming culture discourses. Always reflect, why is it important to me? This is what leads us to think about why equity, diversity, and inclusion are important. When I speak about equity, diversity, and inclusion, unfortunately, we always pack them in one thing. It becomes one acronym. However, I want with this to show that there is a huge difference between the 3. So it is important to engage with the different concepts and get acquainted with the meaning of equity. So what does equity mean? And we know that it is not a language course, of course. It's not, about the terminology, but how we unpack and how we understand equity. So we agree that it requires the presence of processes that promote equal access to opportunities by providing support based on individual and group needs, which is completely different from equality, where we provide the same thing for all the people. What does diversity from the perspective that I am engaging here? Diversity in terms of differences in gender, race, cultural backgrounds, sexualities, ability, lived experiences, knowledges, ways of knowing and doing. It requires more than increasing representations from marginalized groups, which is what we call tokenistic diversity. Real diversity is not a check in the box. We have a Black guy, we have a Black woman, we have a woman of color, we have, a member of LGBTQ. It is not about checking boxes of what colors, what ethnicities, what sexual orientation we have. The most important thing that we consider diversity in ways of knowledges and ways of knowing and doing. Inclusion. And here is the step that moves forward. Principles of equity, believing in a more than a tokenistic diversity. We move with an inclusion framework. What does this mean? Inclusion is coming, and it comes with an active, intentional, and continuous process to address inequities. So it's not about feelings. It's not about being nice or good. It's about processes, systems to address inequities in power and privilege, to build respectful and diverse community. Why is it very important? Because it's only at this step of inclusion that we ensure that people feel a sense of belonging and they can participate meaningfully without sacrificing anything as part of their identities or culture or sexualities or abilities. Let's look at this photo, and I'm sure that we have it everywhere. Equal treatment, equitable treatment, and inclusion. What I wanted to highlight in this photo or in this image, that we are not here focusing on what we offer, rather than we are focusing on dismantling barriers. Because the problem is, we have a system that is based on advantaging certain groups, disadvantaging others. So when we think from an inclusive framework, we are thinking about how we can prioritize dismantling the barriers, which means that inclusion, it is recognizing and leveraging diversity so as to allow members of different cultural groups, identity groups, varying across lines of ethnicity, race, nationality, gender, age, sexual orientation, ability, disability, to work together without ignoring these differences. So inclusion is a far more complex process of engagement with equity and diversity. Reflect on your environment. And I will activate the poll. Sorry. Not this one. Please go to the, yes, reflect on your identities. Sorry. Yeah, okay. I think this is missing in the Slido. Can you please, okay, reflect on your environment and which is prevalent. Can you please, either you talk or you can put it in the chat. Which is more prevalent? Equity, equality, or inclusion? I'll be happy to hear your voices too. Yes. Reflect. What do we see? What is, after the definitions that I gave, the image that we shared, and so what is prevalent in our environment? Are we seeing an environment where we have equality, an environment where we have equity, or an environment that is characterized by inclusion, where everyone can participate regardless of their, identities? Yes, please.
So
Any
Naila,
comments?
in the chat function, there's been a few equities and equalities put forward.
Okay, I will turn on the poll. Okay, so even though this is not the right, thank you so much. I will equality, yes, yeah. Why I ask this question? Because the first thing to engage in change, we need first of all to examine how is our environment constructed. So from your answers, we are still even in the stage of equality. We haven't moved to equity or even, to inclusion yet, or even to equity. And this raises questions. What is our responsibility to move forward? As we are moving in this space and reflecting on our environment, I would like to show you this. I know it is sad, and I know it is not, sometimes we are shocked to hear these things, but these are reality. I know sometimes you would say, oh, I work in a lab. I do things that are far away from being in healthcare, in relationship to direct connections. But when I'm talking about racism, and particularly in our environment, not only in medicine or healthcare, but even on everyday lives, it is a kind of it is hard. But when we talk about it in medicine and in healthcare in particular, the conversation gets more complex, given the moral and ethical values of the profession. That's why it is necessary to move, from our comfort zone and to see the realities. Because even if it hurts, we have to be part of the solutions. So in these, and these are media, news, it's the situation of let's say, healthcare providers, physicians from, IBPOC, which is quite interesting to explore. It speaks about racial bias, in healthcare system. It speaks about the systemic racism against people of color, Black and Indigenous, immigrants, refugees, all types. So racism is pervasive in our healthcare system. It is entrenched and deeply, deeply, deeply entrenched in the system. Ignoring it is not part of the solution. We have to pause, reflect, examine, and rethink our practices. We will try to go deeper into that. We'll take a minute. Go with me in this scenario. Try to visualize yourself in the following scenario. You are on your way to a conference to present to your peers about a study you have been working on. You are very excited and rushing out to the airport. You are the last person to board the plane. You nearly knock over the pilot as you rush to take your seat. After checking into the hotel, you join several colleagues for dinner at a nearby restaurant. You have a lovely time catching up with them. At the table next to you is a couple who look like they may be celebrating their anniversary or some other joyous event. The next morning, you are up early to catch the keynote address. You can't wait to see the keynote speaker because you are very passionate about the research. So 3 situations we have here. Did you visualize yourself in the 3 situations? Okay. I'll ask you 3 questions you don't need to answer. Just think. Was the pilot Black? Second question. Was the couple same-sex couple? Was the scholar an indigenous woman or a woman of color? We don't need to, it's one exercise that lets us get deeper into what we call biases and how certain knowledges are constructed unconsciously within us. In medical school, doctors are taught that their personal backgrounds, characteristics of their patients should be excluded from clinical decisions. But in reality, healthcare providers are just as susceptible to unconscious bias as everybody. We have to understand that, unfortunately, unconscious bias can lead to false assumptions, negative outcomes, dangerous healthcare. So why do we need to talk about bias? And particularly, I'm starting with the person, with our experiences. And that's why the scenario, the first scenario I gave, is about our experiences. Just think about yourself boarding the plane, sitting on the bus, seeing two empty seats. Reflect on, why do you choose that seat and not the other one? Why do you choose to sit next to that person and not to that person? And conscious bias is happening everywhere, every time with us. So it's about favorable and unfavorable attitudes. It can be also positive, by the way, about a group that informs how we perceive, interact, and behave. So unconscious biases, they are shaping how we act, how we behave, how we talk. So they are automatically activate. And I'm talking to scientists and experts in that. This has been a subject of psychological research for such a long time. So they are the result of evolutionary psychology, which has hardwired us to view the world in terms of social categories. This in turn has led to so many things, stereotyping, and particularly, led to exclusionary practices. There is a nice quote by a famous psychologist. Being biased is how we get through life without everything being brand new every time we experience it. What does this mean? When Brett Pelham talks about that, it means that everyone has biases, and biases are shortcuts that our brain uses based on our own culture, upbringing, experience, education, things other people tell us, institutional influences, particularly schools, universities, hospitals, whatever, environment we are engaged in. Other external influences, particularly media and social media. How do movies describe people? How do the news talk about people? What do we know about other groups and other people? So biases comes into play in nearly every aspect of our day-to-day lives. It starts from the parents you decide to have conversation with when you are driving your kid to school. It's about who are the colleagues you are sitting with every day to have your lunch? Who is joining you in celebrating certain events? One of the things I learned from one of the scholars in anti-racism, Robin DiAngelo, She said, I invite everybody to look at their albums since they were children and see who were they pictured with. Once you do that, you will understand a lot. So what does this lead to? When we have biases, unconsciously we develop stereotypes. Stereotypes will lead to categorization. We put people into boxes. That's why we have, sexism, racism, ableism, genderism, cissexism, homophobia, etc. So it's about categorizing people, and most of the time, these stereotypes are based on non-found reasons. Categorization, and then the worst thing is that we start the cycle of generalization. So one single person can be the prototype of a whole category. So stereotype is an exaggerated belief, image, or distorted truth about a person or group. A generalization that allows for little or no individual differences or social variation. This consequently develops a sense of prejudice. Until now, we are not talking about any bad actions or bad acts. It is happening inside us. And this is what explains why we avoid to move from our comfort zone to meet, know, interact with other people. Prejudice is an opinion or a judgment or attitude about a group or its individual members. A prejudice can be positive, but in our usage refers to a negative attitude. Prejudices are often accompanied by ignorance, fear, or hatred. When I talked about the exclusion cycle as opposite to inclusion, as I explained it, if we see this cycle and how it functions, you might disagree with me, but let's explore it. So what we have in this system, so we move from the personal to the system or the institutional. We have dominant identities overrepresented in positions of power, influence, and leadership. Just think about it. Which group is dominant in our context? And it's overrepresented in power, influence, and leadership. So what does this happen? Eventually, we have people who are going to decide on policy. So we have policy decisions that are influenced by dominant knowledge, culture, bias, and prejudice. And then these policies will be adopted in institutions, and the institution will enforce these dominant practices. Of course, when these practices are based on unilateral, unique perspective, we will have inequities because there will be inequitable access to opportunities, for example, in education, health, employment. Eventually, this exclusion will marginalize non-dominant groups because they are excluded, their perspectives and needs are ignored, and eventually we will get back to the starting point, which is that we will always be run by the dominant group identities and perspectives. The cycle of exclusion continues because we are taught to continue it. Because even for what we call internalized bias, and particularly when we speak about internalized, even sometimes people of color, they believed in the supremacy of the system they have been marginalized in. We learn that we are rewarded when we accept and play in the system. So how we can move forward when we understand that this is a system which can be inequitable, marginalizing other groups, and feeling the responsibility that we have to understand that the whole system has been normalized. This is what we call normal. Because other systems have been described, treated as inferior. So for us, it may have been so normalized that we don't even recognize it as an exclusion, particularly when we think about the meritocracy myth, because we have developed in the system that can exclude a lot of people, but we think that, oh, if you work hard, you will go and you will reach whatever you want, without seeing the barriers that have been dominating the whole system and where people do not have the same chances to reach the same goals. So here, the most important thing is, what role am I playing in the system? Am I complicit? Am I thinking about acting in ways that make me complicit? Am I responsible enough to engage with an ethical commitment to advance equity, diversity, and inclusion? In simple ways, bias leads to prejudice, prejudice leads to discrimination, discrimination leads to inclusion. Can you identify biases in your environment? I will try to use the Slido, hopefully that we are on the right ball. Yes, can you identify biases in your environment? What kind of dominant biases do you have in your environment? Particularly when we think about, stereotypes, discriminatory practices. Yeah, if you want to talk, it will be great pleasure. I opened the conversation. What about sexism here, and particularly the gender bias? Does it manifest in ways of, I don't know, policies, promotion, hiring? And I am sure that, yes, promotion of males. Yes, thank you so much. Sexism. It's a male-dominated workplace. Yeah. Engaging with, and that's why I hope that with this session, you will start as a unit reflecting on the things that sometimes people don't even think that it's abnormal. Yeah. Mechanisms, processes of promotion or hiring or employment. And I see here most of the comments, they are about, sexism, male-dominated workplace. Yes. I have no clue on the racial ethnic component of your unit, but there will be great opportunities for you to examine who is there. Who are the people on the table? And this is how we can start, with a lot of humility and humbleness, with a lot of vulnerability, to examine where we are in this conversation. Are we really serious about it? Or are we trying to be, or we will stay complicit in the system? All of us, in all our different positions. So when I do this, I think that bias that superstars are, if there is an issue of, for example, here, gender bias, there should be a clear commitment to work on that, to unpack that, to understand how deep is this impacting the environment you are working in. When unconscious bias influence the way we see things, the way we do things, the way we decide on things, the way we connect to people, the way we decide to smile to the faces of certain people or not, the way we decide where I sit in a dining hall, where I go, even where I spend my holidays. But it is important to say that biases also impact the way, the language we use. You are presented here with the definition of microaggressions. Microaggression was a word coined by Dr. Chester Pierce, a Harvard psychiatrist. What is interesting about that, when I look at the word and the origin of this word, it's very important that when it was implemented, it was designed to talk with less aggression when we use the word racism. People were not comfortable even hearing the word racism. So to minimize the emotional impact, it's very important to understand that microaggressions is a term used for brief and commonplace daily verbal behavioral environmental indignities, whether intentional or intentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative prejudicial slights and insults toward any group, particularly culturally marginalized groups. We have three types. In Dr. Daryl Wing Su's book, Microaggressions in Everyday Life, he outlines three different types of microaggressions. He differentiates between micro-assaults, micro-invalidations, and micro-insults. What does this mean? A micro-assault is an explicit racial derogation, and it is meant to hurt. People use it to hurt other people. It's not a hate crime, it's just a word. Like name calling, avoidant behavior, discriminatory actions. The micro-invalidation and the micro-insults are characterized by they are unconscious, as I said, and they have developed with the impact of our biases all along our life. Micro-invalidations is to negate or nullify feelings or experiential reality of people of color. A micro-insult is characterized by communication that convey rudeness and insensitivity and demean a person's racial heritage or identity. I get you an examples, list of examples. When we say that the most qualified person should get the job, we are here annihilating systemic racism and injustice because we believe in the myth of meritocracy. When we say I'm not racist, I have several Black friends, and so what? What is your, it doesn't mean that you have Black friends that you are not racist. The question is, how can we engage with allyship, with understanding how deep these experiences are shaping people's lives every day. This is not about you. It's about them. It's about the system that marginalizes them. When we speak to a woman of color and we say, you are so articulate. Yeah, oh, this is the first time I see someone from somewhere not having that, had that accent or speaking without accent. A color blindness. When we think that there is only one race, you remember when Black Lives Matter emerged, we have people engaging with all lives matter. So what does this mean? That we all have, or all races have, been treated equally and equitably all along these centuries. So we cannot not see colors. Colors are real, and race is impacting people's lives, opportunities, futures. When we say, oh, we are better than the United States, Canada is multicultural. What kind of multiculturalism are we talking about? Dining, dress, and dance, which means the superficial meanings of multiculturalism. When we talk to a person, or when we see, or we talk about people and we say, oh, where are you really from? Not only where are you from, where are you originally from? Where are you really from? Questioning, does this person really belong to that place? Another maybe form that we are most of the time unconscious of it, which is environmental microaggressions. As you are walking to your office or your lab, think about the title, or let's say the name of the lab you are working in. Whose names are we using in our labs to name our buildings? What kind of images are displayed on our walls? Who are the scientists we are citing? Just reflect on that. When you are walking in the corridors, just look at the walls and see who is represented in that environment and who is, absent. These questions are very important to address because microaggressions are similar to carbon monoxide. They are invisible but potentially lethal. Because many people remember from the time they go out from their houses, they are encountering these microaggressions in terms of body language, in terms of utterances, in terms of actions, in terms of policies, whatever. So we need to have a clear understanding that racial microaggressions and microaggressions in general, they are harmful and they have harmful impact. When we examine this, it is extremely to engage with our power and privilege. When we talk about privilege, it is not to feel guilty, and it is not to put people under the spot. One necessary stage to examine inequity and injustices is to examine privilege. Privilege exists and operates on personal, interpersonal, cultural, and institutional level. It gives unearned advantages, favors, and benefits to members of dominant groups. No one is blaming anyone for being born white, for being born male, for being born in a wealthy family, for being born in a nice neighborhood where crimes is, the number of crimes is very low, for just having the opportunities to continue higher education without being indebted. So all these are different ways of examining, but privilege is characteristically invisible to people who have it. But we need to understand that privilege, when not used properly, can confer dominance, can give permission to control because of one's race or gender. I move to this wheel and I give you 1 minute, please, to examine it. Have you seen this wheel before? I'm sure that you have seen it somewhere. They are using it in a lot of training. Is the wheel clear for you? You can see, because here we have different markers of identities. Skin color, education, ability, sexuality, mental health, body size, etc. Can you take a minute here? Where do you put yourself in this wheel? Just, imaginary, check the boxes here. Where are you in terms of skin color, citizenship, gender, housing, body size, all this kind of, where are you? If we examine the central wheel, which is centered around white, able-bodied, heterosexual, so does this mean that we need to move back and say, oh, I can't do anything because I'm not in this wheel? But this wheel is giving us a sense of that power dynamics are extremely important. And the first thing we need to examine is our connections in terms of these capital. I quote here Bourdieu, a famous scholar in education, who says, cultural, capital. So these are capitals that we carry with us. Where do you have capital and where do you miss it? So it is important for us to be aware of our positionality. Sometimes people close to power in most of their identities may report feeling guilty. However, those close to power have an incredible responsibility to use that power to advance equity, diversity, and inclusion. Examining power is not to say, oh, I feel guilty, I don't want to discuss that. I have no guilt in that. No. On the opposite, examine your power and your privilege, because the more you examine them, you see the potential you have in terms of being an EDI champion. Another layer of understanding about our positionality is intersectionality, because sometimes, and this word, it's Crenshaw's, Dr. Professor Kimberly Crenshaw, a legal scholar. She coined this word in 1989 to talk about the overlap of two forms of marginalization regarding Black women. Black women, they were not only victims and marginalized because of their color, but also of their sex, so gender. So it is a layer which makes it. Imagine, in my personal research, I did my research with Black girls and Muslim, and I found out that girls who are Black and Muslim wearing a veil, they are exposed to more layers of marginalization than other girls their age. So we need to see how different layers of our identities, either they are all pushing us and advancing our privileges, or they are even worsening our marginalization. So it's a lens, it's a prism for seeing the way in which various forms of inequality often operate together. We can see how these things in all these identity markers either can worsen the situation of certain individuals and groups. And this leads us to understand that we do not need to overgeneralize groups because they are not static. We need to see the intergroup differences. Groups are not identical. They go through different experiences, and we need to be sensitive to these things. I think we can just, I want you to reflect on your identities and privileges. How do you describe relation to power? And this is a necessary step to identify how we are able to, okay, I need to go to the list of polls. Yeah, it is open now. Oh, sorry, yeah, we have this, forget about that, because they were the answer for the other poll. But reflect on your identities and privileges. How do you describe your relation to power? Even if it is too early for you to think about that, I think it is very important to start locating your positionality here. I'm sure that it takes time for you to reflect on that, and that's why I will move to the next slide. Think about it. Cloudy with a chance of sun. Yeah, absolutely. Very, 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 very interesting. And this is something that we are going to work on also for the next session, how to unpack our responsibility as privileged, responsible, well-educated. I have my privilege and some power, absolutely. And I think we are all in this space enjoying certain privileges. Absolutely, yes. We can't get enough of privilege here. You reflect, you examine your environment. What is important is know your privilege and how it empowers you or disempowers you. Reduce guilt and increase responsibility. Flip the coin. Yes, I have privileges. I acknowledge it, and I know where I am in that wheel. Now, what is my responsibility? Ask how systemic injustice operates and how it marginalizes. It's not about you. It's not about me. It's about all of us. Change starts with us as individuals, but we need to all work together towards a meaningful change. Use your privilege. And here is the key questions. How am I going to use my privilege? As a scholar, as a learner, as a resident, as an attendant, as a dean, in all the capacities, how can I use my privilege to advance equity, diversity, and inclusion? Resist, first of all, your bias. Remember the scenario I gave you. Ask your questions. How would I respond if this person was a different gender, race, ethnicity? Would I think the same way? Examine what is the basis for your assumptions about this person or this group. Where do I have my idea about this group or this person? Maybe once you crossed ways in the corridor and he or she or they didn't say hi to you. You felt a sense of disrespected. Oh, he doesn't respect me or he doesn't like me. So what is the basis of my assumptions? Personal experience, you read about them, you watched a movie, you were taught that in certain circumstances. Then why do I think and I believe that? Examine the deep levels of biases. Where does this come from? For what can I do to educate myself? So that I'm aware of my own assumptions. I like one, an important saying says, it's about bring the flashlight and put it on yourself. Disengage from yourself. Take a distance, look at yourself from distance. Why am I thinking this way about this? How have you been impacted all along your life and experiences? When you act against microaggressions, for example, in your work environment or learning environment, you heard someone saying something offensive or even a joke. I heard you say something. Can you explain what you mean by? Use words like communicate impact. Using words like makes me feel uncomfortable. You need to start raising awareness. I believe a more inclusive term is, and we have in the Faculty of Medicine, we have a whole project that was done about inclusive language. If you need to have an idea about it, you can contact me, and we can, because we have a whole, project of inclusive language. Reaffirm boundaries. We do not tolerate that kind of language, and I ask that everyone speak to patients or colleagues with respect. My last slide, the one before the last. Are we running? Okay, short. When we speak about change, we are not only talking about personal. We need to go about, and you see them, I don't need even to read them. Is the slide clear to you? But since everyone has a role in social systems, so each one of us have a role and responsibility in dismantling the systems that perpetuate inequities. So in fact, it's the responsibility lies on the shoulders of people who have power. So we need to move forward to understand that developing this framework requires personal work, requires interpersonal, intergroup work, and an impact on organizational level in terms of leadership. Eventually, we use the strategies of pause. Pay attention to what actually is happening beneath the judgment and assessments. Acknowledge your own reactions, interpretations, and judgments. Understand the other possible reactions, interpretations that may be possible. Search for the most constructive, empowering, or productive way to deal with any situation. Execute your action plan. If this means that we need to reflect and re-examine and put a flashlight on the system and on us and where we are in this system. That's why I can't find better than these words. We do not have to be me in order for us to fight alongside each other. I do not have to be you to recognize that our wars are the same. What we must do is commit ourselves to some future that can include each other and to work toward that future with the particular strengths of our individual identities. So in order for us to do this, we must allow each other our differences at the same time as we recognize our sameness. Thank you so much for listening. Open to your questions and looking forward to your feedback.
Thanks very much, Neela. I like that last slide. I think it's a good summary of a lot of the principles you've gone through. It's 1 o'clock, so obviously people might have to leave for other meetings and responsibilities, but yeah. I do want to allow people who want to stay late to ask any questions. Are you okay to stay for a few more minutes, Neela?
Okay. Of course, yes. Yeah. I'm with you.
Yeah. A lot of thank yous showing up in the chat function.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Yeah, thank you so much.
I liked your message too, where you